They tossed her into the stormy sea like a broken doll, calling her a witch, but the Duke would not let her die alone. He dove into the coldest ocean, risking everything to pull her from certain death. Would he make it in time? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Accusation. The storm had been raging for 3 days. Isolde Rivington pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the cargo hold, her fingers gripping the edge of a crate as the Northern Star pitched violently to starboard. Around her, the crew huddled in small groups, their voices low and urgent beneath the howl of wind and the groan of timbers. Late October in the North Sea was unforgiving, but this storm felt personal, as if the very ocean had turned against them. "It's her," someone muttered. Ever since she came aboard, Isolde kept her eyes down, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. 3 weeks. She had managed 3 weeks of near invisibility on this voyage from London to Inverness, keeping to herself, speaking to no one, drawing no attention. 3 weeks of hope that she might finally reach the Scottish Highlands, might finally disappear into some remote village where no one knew her name or her history. 3 weeks, and now it was all collapsing. "The provisions went bad the day after we left London," a sailor continued, his voice rising. "And the rigging good rope don't just snap like that. Not without cause. Tom Fletcher's burning with fever," another added, raving about ice in his blood. "Ain't natural." First Mate William Garrett stood near the hold's entrance, his weathered face tight with discomfort. He was a man of 40, with the kind of steady presence that came from decades at sea. His hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the doorframe as the ship rolled again. Isolde had noticed him watching her during the voyage, not with suspicion like the others, but with something closer to concern. He had a daughter, she'd overheard, back in Portsmouth. Perhaps that's what she saw in his eyes now, the instinct to protect, warring with the instinct to survive. But fear was winning. Even in Garrett, fear was winning. The smell of smoke filled Isolde's nostrils suddenly, though there was no fire in the hold. A memory, visceral and unwanted, dragged her back 16 years. The town square, the stake, her mother's hair, dark like Isolde's own, catching the first flames. She had been 12 years old, small for her age, held back by neighbors who'd known her since birth. Her mother had turned her head, just once, their eyes meeting across the crowd, and in that final moment, Margaret Rivington had smiled a small, sad smile that said everything words could not. "Hide what you are, my darling. The world is not ready for you." Her mother had never spoken those words aloud, but Isolde had heard them nonetheless, had felt them in her bones, had carried them like a stone in her chest for 16 years, because it should have been Isolde at that stake. It was Isolde who had frozen their neighbor's well in a fit of childish anger. January of 1827, after the man had kicked their dog, 20 feet down, frozen solid in the middle of winter. Impossible. Unnatural. The neighbor had known someone was responsible. He'd accused Margaret, the midwife, the woman who knew herbs and old remedies. And when 8-year-old Isolde had tried to confess, her mother had stopped her with a hand over her mouth and eyes that said, "I will not let them burn you." So Margaret Rivington had died for her daughter's sin, and Isolde had learned to hide. The cargo hold door slammed open, admitting a gust of salt spray and Captain Aldrich himself. He was a tall man, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the world. Isolde had learned his story in whispers. His wife and infant daughter, dead in childbirth, 15 years ago during a storm much like this one. A passenger woman had begged him to turn back to shore, and he'd refused. Cargo was time-sensitive. Schedules were sacred. The woman had cursed him as she stood on deck, watching the captain's wife convulsed in labor below. Within the hour, both mother and child were dead. Captain Aldrich had feared cursed women ever since. His eyes found Isolde immediately, and in them she saw the same wild certainty she'd seen in the faces of those who'd condemned her mother. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the hold's nervous murmurs. "Come here." Isolde stood on shaking legs. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt it building for days like pressure before a storm. The crew's suspicion, the captain's growing paranoia, the way people edged away from her in the narrow corridors below deck. She followed Aldrich up to the main deck, the crew trailing behind like scavengers following blood in the water. The storm hit her with physical force. Rain lashed her face, and wind tore at her skirts and shawl. The deck was slick, treacherous, and above them the sails snapped and thundered like cannon fire. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the massive waves that surrounded them. And there, near the mainmast, was a barrel of wine, frozen solid. Isolde's heart stopped. "Explain that," Captain Aldrich demanded, pointing at the barrel. "We stored it in the warmest part of the hold, next to the galley stove. Wine doesn't freeze. Not like that. Not in autumn." "I don't," Isolde began, but her voice was lost in the wind. "She was near it this morning," a sailor shouted. "I seen her, standing right beside it, muttering to herself." "I wasn't muttering," Isolde protested. "I was praying." But the distinction meant nothing to frightened men. A figure emerged from the shadows near the ship's cabin, a passenger, well-dressed despite the storm, his dark coat and fine boots marking him as gentry. Lord Marcus Thorne. Isolde had noticed him before, watching the other passenger who travelled alone. This man's eyes were calculating, cold, like he was solving a puzzle only he could see. "Did the storm worsen when she came aboard?" Marcus asked Captain Aldrich, his tone perfectly reasonable, perfectly poisonous. "I'm merely curious about the timing." Aldrich's eyes widened. "The first day out of London. We had fair winds until she boarded," Marcus finished smoothly. He turned to Isolde with an expression of polite interest. "Has anyone touched your belongings, miss? Examined them for unusual items?" "I have nothing unusual," Isolde said, her voice steadier now, anger beginning to burn through fear. "I'm a seamstress, travelling to find work. That's all." "A seamstress," Marcus repeated, as if the word itself was suspicious. "Travelling alone, to the remote highlands. How very enterprising." Another figure stood apart from the gathering crowd, a man who'd been keeping to himself throughout the voyage. He called himself Edward Moore, but there was something about him that spoke of better breeding than the name suggested. His clothes were too fine, too well-tailored, despite their deliberate plainness. His posture too straight. His speech, the few times Isolde had overheard it, too educated. Now he watched the scene unfolding with troubled eyes. Isolde saw recognition in his face, not of her, but of the moment itself. The mob forming, the scapegoat chosen, the terrible momentum of fear seeking an outlet. "Captain Aldrich," First Mate Garrett said, his voice measured, "we've no proof of wrongdoing. Strange weather and spoiled provisions, these are the hazards of sea travel. We cannot blame—" "Tom Fletcher is dying," someone shouted from the back. "Dying of unnatural fever. What more proof do we need?" The crowd's energy shifted, darkened. Isolde felt it like a change in temperature. She'd felt this before the moment a group of individuals became a mob, united by fear and the need for simple answers to complex problems. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "I've done nothing. I'm no witch. I'm just—" But her terror was rising, and with it, something else. Something she'd spent 16 years suppressing, pushing down, denying. The cold that lived in her bones, the frost that answered to her fear like a faithful dog to its master. The ship's lanterns, 6 of them, hanging from the rigging and masts, suddenly flared bright as miniature suns. The crew cried out, shielding their eyes. And when the light died back to normal, frost was spreading across the deck where Isolde stood. Not just a little frost, not just a touch of ice, but a spreading pattern of white crystals that crept outward from her feet, like roots, beautiful and terrible and absolutely impossible to deny. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting had been. Captain Aldrich's face drained of colour. The crew members backed away, some making signs against evil. First Mate Garrett looked at Isolde with something like grief in his eyes, but he said nothing, did nothing. Only Marcus Thorne seemed unsurprised. He watched with detached interest, then shifted his gaze to the man who called himself Edward Moore. Watching, waiting. Captain Aldrich's voice, when it came, was hollow, final. "Throw the witch overboard." The words hung in the storm-torn air. Isolde felt hands grab her arms, rough, frightened hands that held her like she might explode at any moment. She wanted to fight, to scream, to unleash the full force of what she was and freeze them all where they stood. But she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her that the world was not ready. So Isolde did not resist as they dragged her toward the ship's rail, toward the black and churning sea below. She looked once at First Mate Garrett, hoping for intervention, for mercy. He looked away. She looked at the man called Edward Moore, this stranger who watched with anguish in his eyes, and as they lifted her to throw her into the freezing North Sea, Isolde saw Lord Marcus Thorne lean close to the stranger and whisper something. Saw the stranger's eyes widen with recognition and anger. Saw Marcus smile, cold and satisfied, as if a game he'd been playing had just reached its critical move. Then Isolde was falling, and the ocean rose up to meet her, and the last thing she heard before the water closed over her head was Captain Aldrich's voice, shaking but certain. "May the sea take what the land will not suffer to live." The cold was absolute, final, and in her terror, Isolde felt her powers answer, felt the temperature around her plummet, felt ice beginning to form even in the salt water, felt herself becoming the storm she'd always feared she was. And somewhere above, on the deck of the Northern Star, two men stood at the rail. One watched with calculating satisfaction, the other, without thinking, without hesitation, without any concern for his own survival, dove into the freezing sea after her. Chapter 2. The Plunge. Edmund Westmore, though he'd been calling himself Edward Moore for 3 years, stood frozen at the rail as rough hands dragged Isolde toward her death. He should look away. He should return to his cabin, maintain his anonymity, protect the carefully constructed shield of ordinariness he'd built around himself. He'd boarded the Northern Star specifically to disappear, to become no one, to escape the suffocating judgment of English society. But he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away from the terror in her eyes as she searched the crowd for mercy that would not come. Her gaze found First Mate Garrett, the weathered sailor's face twisted with shame, but he turned his head, unable to meet her silent plea. Cowardice, Edmund recognized, the same cowardice that had frozen him in place 3 years ago while his brother fell. Lord Marcus Thorne stood near the mainmast, perfectly dry despite the storm, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of a man observing a theatrical performance. His eyes shifted to Edmund, and something flickered in them, anticipation, perhaps, or challenge. "Don't," those eyes seemed to say. "Don't be the fool you've always been." The crew lifted Isolde. She was small, light, easily handled. She didn't fight them. That was somehow worse than if she'd struggled. She'd simply accepted her fate, the way people did when the world had beaten them down too many times. Edmund's mind conjured another moment. Another person held aloft, though by a horse rather than men. The 23rd of March, 1840, a hunting party in Derbyshire, the kind of mindless entertainment that young men of privilege engaged in to fill their empty days. Thomas had been 22, golden-haired and laughing, full of the easy charm that had always come so naturally to him. Edmund, at 25, had already been Duke of Thornfield for a year, already crushed under the weight of responsibility their father's death had bestowed. Thomas had no such burden. Thomas was free. "Watch this, Edmund," his brother had called out, grinning as he urged his horse toward the stone fence. Too high. Edmund had known immediately it was too high. The other men had already refused the jump. But Edmund's university friends were watching, wealthy young men who'd known the brothers since childhood, and Edmund, tired of being the responsible one, the serious one, had said nothing, had perhaps even smiled, had let his brother chase glory for the entertainment of fools. The horse had refused at the last moment. Thomas had gone over alone. The crack of his brother's neck breaking had been sickeningly clear in the spring air. Edmund had reached him within seconds, but seconds were too long. Thomas lay twisted on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, his eyes already glassing over, but he'd seen Edmund, had smiled with those bloody lips. "Not your fault, Edmund," Thomas had whispered. "Don't blame yourself. Promise me." Edmund had promised, had lied to his dying brother. Now, aboard the Northern Star, they threw Isolde overboard. Edmund saw Thomas's face in hers as she fell, saw that terrible moment of acceptance, of resignation to death, saw the opportunity to act vanish in the space of a heartbeat while he stood paralyzed by indecision. Not again, not again. "No!" Edmund shouted, lunging forward. Marcus's voice cut through the storm. "Westmore, don't be a fool." The name hung in the air like an accusation. Several crew members' heads snapped toward Edmund, recognition dawning, but Edmund was already moving, already climbing the rain-slick rail, already diving. The October North Sea hit him like a physical blow, 40 degrees at most. The cold drove the air from his lungs instantly, completely. His heavy wool coat, soaked through in seconds, became an anchor, dragging him down. Salt water burned his eyes, his nose, his throat. The storm-churned waves tossed him like a child's toy, but he forced his eyes open despite the sting, forced his legs to kick despite the cold stealing the strength from his muscles, forced himself downward, into the black water, searching. There, a pale shape sinking below him, dark hair spreading like ink through the water. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, her body limp and unresisting as the sea claimed her. Edmund kicked harder, his lungs screaming for air. His coat dragged at him with every movement. His boots felt like iron weights. The distance between them seemed impossible, but he reached, stretched, his fingers straining. His hand closed around her wrist. Her skin was ice cold, colder even than the sea around them. For a moment Edmund wondered if she was already dead, if he dove into freezing water for a corpse. But there was no time for such thoughts. His vision was darkening at the edges, his lungs burning with the need to breathe. He kicked toward the surface, dragging Isolde's dead weight with him. The storm above churned the water into chaos. Which way was up? The darkness was absolute, disorienting. Edmund's heart hammered against his ribs, panic rising. Then light, a flash of lightning penetrating the water. Edmund followed it, kicked with everything he had, his free arm pulling at the water, while his other hand maintained its death grip on Isolde's wrist. They broke the surface together. Edmund gasped, choking on salt water and rain, barely able to keep his head above the waves. Isolde's face was blue-white, her lips purple, no breath moving in or out. He hooked his arm around her chest, trying to keep her head above water, but the current was pulling them away from the ship. His coat was drowning him. His muscles were failing. He was going to die here. They both were. "Rope!" A voice from the ship, First Mate Garrett's voice, rough with something like anguish. "Throw the rope, you fools! I'll not have 2 deaths on my conscience today." The captain said, someone began. Damn what the captain said. Throw the bloody rope. Something splashed into the water 3 feet to Edmund's left. He kicked toward it, his movements clumsy, desperate. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled for the rope. Once, twice, finally caught it. He wrapped it around his wrist, unable to grip properly, and held Isolde against him with his other arm. "Pull!" he tried to shout, but it came out as a croak. They pulled. The ascent was agony. Edmund's shoulders felt like they were being torn from their sockets. The rope cut into his wrist. Isolde's weight dragged at him, and twice he nearly lost his grip on her. The ship's hull loomed above them, dark and massive, and for a moment Edmund was certain they'd be crushed against it. But hands reached down, many hands now, fear overcome by the simple human instinct to save life. They grabbed Edmund's coat, his arms, finally Isolde herself. Someone hauled her aboard first, then Edmund, who collapsed on the deck like a landed fish, coughing seawater and gasping. His vision swam. Faces appeared above him, distorted by rain and his own disorientation. Someone was shouting. The deck tilted violently, and Edmund slid several feet before hands caught him. "Your nobility," Captain Aldrich's voice, hollow with shock. Edmund managed to focus on the captain's face. The man stared down at him with an expression of dawning horror, not at the near drowning, but at the realization of what he'd done. "Duke Edmund Westmore of Thornfield." Marcus, Thorn's smooth voice cut through the chaos. He stood over Edmund, somehow still immaculate despite the storm. "My old friend has always been impulsive." Friend, the word was a mockery. They'd been friends once, perhaps, before Thomas died, before everything ended. Edmund tried to speak, but his teeth were chattering too violently. His entire body shook with cold so profound it felt like violence. His lips, he knew without seeing, must be as blue as Isolde's. Isolde. Edmund forced himself to turn his head. She lay a few feet away, utterly still. Her skin was the color of snow. Her sodden dress clung to her motionless frame. No breath moved her chest. No life showed in her open, staring eyes. "She's dead," someone whispered. "No." First Mate Garrett knelt beside her, his weathered hands on her chest. He pressed down, again, the rhythm steady. "Come on, girl. Come on." Edmund tried to crawl toward her. His arms wouldn't support his weight. He collapsed back to the deck, helpless, watching Garrett work. "Press, press, press." "It's no use," Captain Aldrich said quietly. "She's gone, and we've nearly lost a duke in the bargain. Get them both below. Get them warm." "No use?" Garrett's voice cracked. "I stood silent while you threw her overboard. I'll not stand silent while she dies." He bent, placing his mouth over hers, breathing for her, then back to the chest compressions. Press, 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 breathe, press, 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 press. Edmund's vision darkened again. The cold was inside him now, in his bones, in his blood. He was dimly aware of Marcus crouching beside him. "You just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Marcus said softly, his voice almost gentle, almost sad. "Always the hero, even when heroism costs everything." Edmund wanted to answer, to defend himself, but his consciousness was slipping away. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was a sound, a gasping, choking sound. Isolde, coughing up seawater. Isolde, alive. And then nothing. Chapter 3. Breathing again. Edmund woke to the creak of timber and the acrid smell of wet wool. His head pounded, his lungs burned with each breath. Every muscle in his body screamed protest as he tried to move, and the cold was still inside him, deep in his bones, as if the North Sea had followed him out of the water. He forced his eyes open. His cabin. Somehow, he was in his private quarters, the only exclusive accommodations the Northern Star offered. His wealth, even traveling under a false name, had purchased this small luxury. Now, it might be the difference between life and death, for her more than for him. Isolde lay on his narrow bed, buried under what appeared to be every blanket on the ship. Her face was still too pale, her lips still tinged with blue, but her chest rose and fell with shallow, fragile breaths. Alive, barely, but alive. First Marty Garrett stood near the small iron stove, feeding it coal with methodical efficiency. The older man's face was drawn, exhausted, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. "You carried us both down?" Edmund's voice came out as a croak. Garrett didn't turn. "Aye." Crew was too stunned to do much but stand and gape. A duke aboard ship, diving after a condemned woman. They didn't know whether to help or hide. He paused, finally looking at Edmund. "I have a daughter her age, back in Portsmouth. Sarah. She's 24, works in a dress shop." His weathered face tightened. "I pray if she were ever in such straits, someone would do the same for her. I pray I'd have the courage you showed." "It wasn't courage," Edmund said, pushing himself upright despite his body's protests. It was courage," Garrett interrupted firmly. "Whatever drove you to it, Your Grace, it was courage." He moved to Isolde's side, checking her breathing with a practiced hand. Her clothes were soaked through, freezing. "I helped remove them clinical-like, proper. Every blanket in your cabin is on her now, and I've heated bricks from the galley." Edmund saw them then, wrapped in cloth and tucked around Isolde's motionless form. "The crew?" Edmund asked. "Restless, frightened. Captain Aldrich is in his quarters, drinking himself senseless, I'd wager. They don't know what to make of any of this." Garrett moved toward the door. "I need to manage them before fear turns to violence again. Can you tend to her?" Edmund looked at his own hands. They trembled with cold and exhaustion, the fingers stiff and aching. But he nodded. Yes. After Garrett left, the silence of the cabin was broken only by the storm's fading howl and Isolde's shallow breathing. Edmund changed out of his sodden shirt with clumsy movements, but kept his damp trousers on. Propriety demanded some barrier between them, even in crisis. He pulled a chair close to the bed and began the work of warming her, her arms first, rubbing circulation back into the ice-cold flesh. Her hands were small, calloused from seamstress work, the nails short and practical. Edmund worked each finger individually, trying to force blood back into the extremities. Then her legs, her feet, always maintaining the blankets over her torso for modesty. He replaced the cooling bricks with fresh ones from the stove, forced a few drops of warm water between her blue lips, though most dribbled out again, adjusted the blankets, checked her breathing, started the process over. Hours blurred together. As Edmund worked, words began spilling from him, words he'd never spoken aloud, truths he'd buried for 3 years. His name was Thomas, Edmund heard himself say. My brother, younger by 3 years. Everyone loved him. I was the serious one, the responsible heir. Thomas was golden. Literally, his hair was like wheat in summer. He laughed easily, made friends wherever he went. He rewrapped a heated brick, placed it near Isolde's feet. The 23rd of March, 1840. A hunting party. I was so tired of being the responsible one. Our father had died the year before, and I was duke at 25. Every decision mine. Every problem mine. Thomas had none of that weight. He was free. Edmund's hands moved mechanically, rubbing warmth into Isolde's arms. My friends from university were there, wealthy idiots, all of us, taking jumps that were too high, drinking too much, behaving like boys instead of men. Thomas wanted to impress them, wanted to impress me. There was a stone fence, ancient, solid, nearly 5 feet high, too high for a safe jump. The words caught in Edmund's throat. He forced them out. Thomas looked at me, asked if he should try it. I could have said no, could have been the serious, responsible Duke and stopped him. But I was tired of being that person, so I smiled, might have even encouraged him. I don't remember exactly. I've spent 3 years trying to remember my exact words, and I can't. Outside, the storm was dying. Evening light filtered weakly through the porthole. His horse refused at the last moment. Thomas went over alone. I heard his neck break from 20 feet away. By the time I reached him, he was dying, blood on his lips. But he smiled at me. He actually smiled. Edmund's voice broke. He said, "Not your fault, Edmund. Don't blame yourself. Promise me." I promised. I lied to my dying brother because I knew it was my fault. If I'd stopped him, if I'd been the responsible one for once more time, he'd still be alive. My mother saw it in my eyes at the funeral, the guilt, the knowledge, and society. They whispered that I'd always been jealous of Thomas, that maybe, just maybe, I'd wanted him dead so I could be the only son. Edmund's hands were shaking violently now, whether from cold or emotion he couldn't tell. So I ran, told everyone I was touring the continent. Instead, I've been running from their judgment, from my own guilt, from the fact that I watched him die and did nothing. He looked at Isolde's still face, and then I watched them throw you overboard, watched another innocent person condemned by fear and ignorance, and I saw Thomas falling all over again, saw myself standing frozen, useless. I couldn't, his voice cracked, I couldn't watch someone else die while I did nothing. A knock at the door interrupted his confession. Edmund stood, his legs unsteady. "Who is it?" "Captain Aldrich, Your Grace." "I need to—" "No." Edmund's voice hardened, finding the aristocratic authority he'd abandoned 3 years ago. "You will not enter this cabin. You will not come near her. Do you understand me, Captain?" "Your Grace," I must explain. "You attempted murder," Edmund said coldly. "You threw a woman overboard without trial, without evidence, based on superstition and fear. If she dies, I will personally see you hanged. If she lives and you harm her again, the result will be the same. Now leave." Silence. Then, footsteps retreating. Edmund returned to his vigil, but he'd barely sat down when another knock came. "Edmund," Marcus Thorne's smooth voice. "Might we talk?" "No. I'm coming in anyway. I promise not to harm your little project." The door opened. Marcus stood in the doorway, still perfectly dressed despite the day's chaos. His cravat was crisp, his coat brushed, his boots polished. He looked like he'd stepped out of a London drawing room rather than survived a storm at sea. "Still playing hero," Marcus observed, his eyes taking in the frost-touched cabin, the unconscious woman, Edmund's disheveled state. "How long has it been since Thomas died? 3 years, and you think saving this girl will absolve you of letting your brother fall?" Edmund stood, positioning himself between Marcus and the bed. "Get out." "Such hostility. We were friends once. That was before. Before I watched you kill your brother with your negligence." Marcus's tone remained conversational, almost gentle. "Before I saw you run away, rather than face the consequences. You know what I find fascinating, Edmund? You dove into freezing water for a stranger, but you stood paralyzed while your own brother died. What does that say about you?" "It says I've learned from my mistakes," Edmund managed. Marcus smiled without warmth. "Or it says you're desperately trying to rewrite history, redemption through a grand gesture. Very romantic, very foolish." He glanced at Isolde. "She's what they claim, you know. I saw the frost on the deck, the lanterns. She's dangerous. She's scared, perhaps, but fear makes people with power even more dangerous." Marcus turned to leave, then paused. "You can't save her, Edmund. You couldn't save Thomas, and you can't save her. Some people are simply meant to fall." The door closed behind him, but his words hung in the air like poison. Edmund returned to Isolde's side, his hands aching, stiff, exhausted, resuming their work. The cabin had grown dark. He lit a lamp with clumsy fingers. Near dawn, as grey light began filtering through the porthole, Isolde gasped. It was a horrible sound, choking and desperate. Her eyes flew open, wild, unseeing. She thrashed against the blankets, her mouth opening in a silent scream, and the cold came. Frost spread across the cabin walls in intricate, impossible patterns. The water in the washing basin froze with a sharp crack. The temperature plummeted so fast Edmund could see his breath crystallizing in the air. Ice crystals formed from nothing, dancing like snow in the lamplight. Edmund's hands were still on her arms. He felt the cold burning into his skin, felt his fingers going numb, felt the agony of flesh freezing. But he didn't let go. Isolde. His voice was calm, steady, though his hands screamed with pain. You're safe. You're alive. Breathe with me. Her wild eyes found his face, focused gradually. She saw his hands turning white where they touched her, saw the pain written in his expression despite his controlled voice. Horror crossed her face. The ice stopped spreading. No, she whispered, jerking away from him. No, I might hurt you. I'm exactly what they said. A monster. A curse. Edmund wrapped his damaged hands in a cloth from the washstand, biting back a gasp at the contact. The pain was extraordinary, but he kept his voice steady. You are not a monster. I watched them throw you overboard for the crime of being different, of being feared. I have spent 3 years being judged for something I cannot change. I could not watch it happen to someone else. Isolde's eyes moved from his bandaged hands to the frost covering the walls, to the ice crystals still hanging in the air. You don't know what I am, what I can do. I killed my mother. I nearly killed you. Everything I touch, I destroy. Then show me, Edmund said simply. She stared at him. What? Show me what you are, what you can do. Not in fear or desperation. Show me deliberately. I can't control it. It just happens. Can you try? Isolde looked at him for a long moment, this aristocrat who dove into freezing water for her, who'd let her freeze his hands rather than release her, who sat before her now asking to see the very thing that had condemned her. Why? She whispered. Why did you save me? Edmund met her eyes. Because I watched someone I loved die while I did nothing. I will not make that mistake again. The ship creaked around them. Outside the cabin, voices murmured Marcus's smooth tones, Captain Aldrich's uncertain responses, plotting, planning. But inside this small space, 2 damaged people looked at each other and recognized something familiar. Isolde pulled the blankets closer, still shivering. Edmund remained in his chair, his frostbitten hands throbbing. Between them lay an uneasy truce, built on shared trauma and desperate hope. Neither knew if it would be enough. But for now, in this frost-touched cabin as dawn broke over the North Sea, it was all they had. Chapter 4. Secrets and Experiments. 3 days passed in the strange intimacy of shared confinement. The Northern Star continued its journey north toward Inverness, now only a week from port. The storm had broken the morning after Edmund's plunge into the sea, leaving behind clear skies and favorable winds. The crew worked with efficient silence, giving Edmund's cabin a wide berth. Superstition proved a more effective barrier than any lock. Inside, Isolde recovered her strength slowly. The color returned to her cheeks. Her breathing deepened, but the shadows under her eyes spoke of sleep, interrupted by nightmares of drowning, of burning, of all the ways the world had tried to destroy her. Edmund's hands told their own story of cost. The frostbite was severe. His fingers had turned an alarming mottled purple-white the first day, then darkened to an angry red. Now, bandaged carefully, they throbbed with constant pain. Simple tasks, buttoning his shirt, holding a cup, lifting a spoon, became exercises in frustration. His right hand was worse. 2 fingers remained stiff and largely numb. He never complained. But Isolde watched him struggle with a cup of tea that morning, watched his bandaged fingers fumble the handle 3 times before he managed to grip it, and guilt carved itself deeper into her chest. Let me help, she said quietly. I can manage. Edmund, she used his given name now, propriety abandoned somewhere in the depths of the North Sea. Please. He relented, allowing her to steady the cup while he drank. Their fingers brushed, and Isolde felt the heat of inflammation beneath his bandages. Infection, possibly. Another consequence of saving her life. The cabin door opened without warning. Marcus Thorne entered, impeccably dressed as always, carrying a slight smile that never reached his eyes. Good morning, he said pleasantly. I trust you're both recovering from your ordeal. Edmund set down his cup with deliberate care. We didn't invite you in. No, but isolation breeds morbidity. I thought you might appreciate news from the world beyond this cabin. Marcus settled himself on the room's single chair with the ease of a man in his own parlor. The crew is restless. Tom Fletcher died yesterday. The fever took him despite the ship's surgeon's best efforts. Isolde felt the words like a physical blow. Another death. Another reason for them to fear her. It wasn't her fault, Edmund said immediately. Wasn't it? Marcus's tone remained conversational. The crew certainly believes it was. They speak of curses and omens. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but superstition has led to worse outcomes than simple fear. He paused, studying them both. Your mother will be relieved you're alive, Edmund, at least until she learns you've taken up with a witch. That will be a different conversation entirely. Edmund's jaw tightened. My mother is not your concern, but she is mine. I've written to her, you know. A letter I'll post when we reach Inverness, informing her that her prodigal son has been found, alive and apparently enamored of a woman accused of witchcraft. I'm certain she'll be understanding. Get out, Edmund said quietly. Marcus rose with unhurried grace. As you wish. But do consider this. You're a duke travelling with a condemned woman. When we reach Scotland, your title carries less weight than it does in England, and stories spread faster than ships sail. He paused at the door. Whatever you're planning, Edmund, I hope it's worth the cost. After he left, silence settled heavy between them. He knows something, Isolde said finally. About your brother, about what happened. Edmund nodded slowly. Marcus was there that day. He saw everything. He flexed his damaged hands, wincing. He has his own version of events, his own interpretation of my guilt. Isolde moved closer, kneeling beside where he sat on the edge of the bed. Tell me. All of it. So he did. The whole story this time, not the confession to an unconscious woman, but a conversation between two people learning to trust each other. He spoke of Thornfield Hall in Derbyshire, of rolling estates and ancestral responsibility, of Thomas's golden charm, his easy laughter, the way he lit up every room he entered. He was 22, Edmund said, his voice distant with memory. He looked up to me in a way that was both flattering and terrifying. I was the Duke, the responsible one. He wanted to prove himself worthy of that regard. So when my friends from university came for the hunting party, Thomas pushed himself, took risks he normally wouldn't. The fence, Isolde prompted gently. Stone, ancient, nearly 5 feet high. Too high for a safe jump, especially after the rain we'd had. The ground was soft, but Thomas was showing off for my friends. For me. Edmund's damaged hands clenched despite the pain. He looked at me before he tried it. I could have stopped him with a word, just one word. But I was tired of being the cautious one, the serious one, so I smiled. Might have even said something encouraging. I truly don't remember. And the horse refused. Thomas went over alone. The fall was bad. I knew it was bad immediately. By the time I reached him, Edmund's voice cracked. He was dying, blood on his lips, but he smiled at me. Actually smiled, and he said, "Don't blame yourself." Those were his last words to me. A gift, I suppose. Forgiveness I didn't deserve. Isolde took his bandaged hands carefully in hers. You blame yourself because he forgave you. Edmund looked at her sharply. If he had cursed you with his dying breath, Isolde continued, you could have fought against it, could have spent your life proving him wrong, showing the world you weren't the villain he named you. But forgiveness you have to accept, and accepting it means forgiving yourself, which is so much harder. The observation struck something deep in Edmund's chest. No one, not his mother, not his friends, not even Marcus, with all his cutting observations, had articulated his guilt this way before. I don't know how to forgive myself, he admitted quietly. Neither do I. Isolde's thumb traced careful circles on the back of his hand, avoiding the bandaged fingers. I've spent 16 years running from what I am, from what I did to my mother. She told him then, the full story she'd only hinted at before. The seamstress shop in London, the 3 years of saving every spare penny for passage to Scotland. I thought in the Highlands, in some remote village, I could simply disappear, be no one, be normal. But you're not no one, Edmund said, and you're not normal. You're extraordinary. I'm dangerous. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Edmund straightened, an idea forming. Your powers, can you control them, deliberately? Isolde withdrew her hands. I've never tried. I've only ever pushed them down, suppressed them. Using them deliberately feels like like accepting what I am. And accepting what I am means accepting that I'm the reason my mother died, that I'm the monster they feared. What if what you are isn't something to fear? Edmund leaned forward, his eyes intense despite his exhaustion. What if control comes not from suppression but from understanding, from practice? I don't. Try something for me, something small. Isolde looked at him uncertainly. What if I hurt you again? Then I'll tell you to stop. Edmund retrieved a cup of water from the washstand, his movements clumsy with his damaged hands. He set it on the small table between them. Lower the temperature. Just 1 degree. Don't freeze it. Just cool it. Edmund, I can't. Try. Isolde stared at the cup. She'd spent 16 years avoiding her powers, pushing them down, pretending they didn't exist. Now Edmund was asking her to do the opposite, to reach for them deliberately. She closed her eyes and reached inward, toward the cold that lived in her bones. It was always there, waiting, like a loyal dog eager to serve. The trick was not letting it overwhelm her, not letting it run wild. 1 degree, she thought, just 1 degree cooler. She felt the change, a subtle shift in the water's temperature, controlled and precise. When she opened her eyes, Edmund was testing the water with his finger. Cooler, he said, wonder in his voice, but not frozen. You did it. Isolde felt a surge of exhilaration, followed immediately by exhaustion. Even that small exercise had drained her. Over the next hours, they continued. Edmund proved a patient teacher, breaking down each exercise into manageable steps. Isolde created a small ice crystal in her palm, maintaining its shape for 30 seconds before her concentration broke and it melted. Success and failure in equal measure. Try this, Edmund said, positioning his bandaged hands near hers without touching. Draw heat from the air around us, but not from me. Can you sense the difference between the ambient temperature and the warmth of a living thing? Isolde tried. She reached for the cold, attempted to pull heat from the air itself. The temperature plummeted. Edmund gasped, jerking his hands away. Frost spread across the table between them. I'm sorry. Isolde pulled back immediately, horrified. I can't control it precisely enough. What if I'd frozen your hands worse? What if... Then we practice more, Edmund said firmly, though his hands were shaking. You succeeded with the cup. That proves control is possible. You just need time. They established a pattern, small exercises, frequent breaks. Edmund watched her carefully, noting that her powers responded most strongly to emotion but could be modulated with focus and intent. Fear made control impossible. Calm made it achievable. On the third afternoon, Isolde surprised them both. She'd been practicing creating ice crystals, each one slightly more complex than the last. Then, without planning it, she began shaping something larger. An ice sculpture formed in the air above her palm, a bird, wings spread in flight, every feather distinct and delicate. It was beautiful, intricate, controlled. Edmund stared at it, mesmerized. I've never seen anything so beautiful. Their eyes met over the frozen bird. The moment stretched, charged with something neither had words for. Isolde felt her cheeks warm, saw an answering color in Edmund's face, then shouting erupted above deck. Get back, the captain gave his word. First, Mate Garrett's voice, raised in anger or warning. Edmund moved to the cabin door, listening. Isolde let the ice bird melt, the magic dissipating. More voices, angry, frightened. The ship's cook. Tom Fletcher's dead, dead because of her. We'll not sail another day with a witch aboard. Captain Aldrich's weaker tones. The Duke has my word of safe passage. Then put them ashore, both of them, at the nearest port. Then Marcus's voice, smooth as silk, carrying clearly through the door. Surely that's best for everyone. The Duke can escort the young woman to safety on land, and your crew can have peace of mind, a compromise that serves all parties. Edmund and Isolde's eyes met. They'd run out of time. Where's the nearest port? Isolde asked quietly. Cromarty, I think. A small fishing village on the Scottish coast. We're perhaps 2 days away. And then, Edmund's jaw set with determination, then we find another way. But whatever happens, Isolde, I won't let them harm you again. I swear it. Outside, Marcus's voice continued, orchestrating their fate with patient malice. The crew's fear was a weapon he wielded expertly, and Edmund's title, powerful in England, meant little on a ship full of terrified men in Scottish waters. Isolde looked at the frost patterns still fading from the table, at Edmund's bandaged hands, at the four walls that had become both sanctuary and prison. They would reach Scotland in 2 days, and then everything would change. Chapter 5. The Storm Within. Cromarty appeared on the horizon at dawn, a collection of grey stone buildings huddled against the Scottish coast, smoke rising from chimneys into the cold November air. 2 days had passed in relative peace. Edmund's hands were healing, though slowly, and 2 fingers on his right hand remained stubbornly numb. Isolde practiced her control daily, each exercise slightly more successful than the last. They'd found a rhythm, a partnership built on patience and necessity. But Isolde's other ability, the one she'd mentioned only briefly, was screaming warnings. She'd tried to explain it to Edmund the previous evening. I sensed the temperature of people's emotions, hot anger, like standing near a fire, cold fear, like touching ice, warm affection, like sunlight on skin. It's not precise, but it's rarely wrong. Now, as the Northern Star approached the Scottish port, Isolde felt spikes of hostile intent from multiple sources. Cold, calculating malice, hot, desperate anger. The emotional temperature of the ship had shifted into dangerous territory. "Something's wrong," she told Edmund, as they prepared for disembarkation. "The crew, their fear has turned to something else, something worse." Edmund checked the cabin door's lock, such as it was. "We'll be ashore within hours. Whatever they're planning, they'll hesitate to act against a duke in port." But Isolde's sense of danger only intensified as evening fell. Edmund left the cabin briefly to arrange lodging in Cromarty, to speak with Captain Aldrich about their departure. "Lock the door behind me," he instructed. "I'll be back within minutes." Isolde did as he asked, but the lock was flimsy, meant more for privacy than security. She stood in the center of the small cabin, her empathic sense screaming warnings, multiple sources of hostile intent converging, getting closer. The door burst open with a crack of splintering wood. 5 men entered, crew members she recognized. The ship's cook led them, a heavy man with ham-sized fists and eyes bright with desperate fear. Behind him came 2 sailors she'd seen, watching her with undisguised hatred. 2 more blocked the doorway, preventing escape. First Mate Garrett was not among them. "The captain's too afraid of the Duke to do what needs doing," the cook said, advancing slowly. "But Tom Fletcher died this evening, died raving about ice in his veins. We'll not have your curse follow us further." Isolde backed against the far wall, her heart hammering. "Tom Fletcher's fever had nothing to do with me. It was an illness, natural causes. Nothing's been natural since you stepped aboard." The cook's voice was rough with fear and something else, grief, perhaps, for his dead shipmate. "We should have let you drown the first time. We're finishing it now. Here in Scottish waters, where the Duke's English title means less, where your body might never wash ashore." Terror flooded Isolde's system. Not again. She couldn't drown again. Couldn't feel the water closing over her head, the cold stealing her breath. The cold. She reached for it instinctively, desperately. Ice formed between her and the advancing men, a barrier, a wall, crystallizing from the moisture in the air itself. The crew members stopped, their eyes widening. "Witch," one of them breathed, but the ice wasn't stable. Isolde's fear was too great, her control too tenuous. The barrier cracked and reformed, spreading beyond where she'd intended, climbing the walls like frost on a winter window. The door behind the men slammed open again. Edmund stood there, taking in the scene instantly. His eyes found Isolde, saw her terror, saw the unstable ice, saw the men advancing despite their fear. He attacked. Edmund had never mentioned his combat training, but it showed now. His aristocratic upbringing had included more than dancing and deportment. He moved with controlled violence, using the doorway to limit how many men could face him at once. His damaged hands slowed him, but desperation and righteous fury compensated. He fought to reach Isolde, and Isolde, watching him fight for her, felt her terror spike beyond control. The storm came. Wind tore through the cabin from nowhere, no natural source, no open windows, just air moving with impossible force. It shrieked like something alive, tearing at clothing and hair. Ice spread across every surface with terrifying speed, coating walls and floor and ceiling in thick layers. The temperature plummeted, 40 degrees in seconds, frost forming on beards and eyebrows. Objects began to lift in the swirling wind currents. The water basin, Edmund's spare coat, books and papers all floating in the maelstrom. Ice crystals filled the air like snow, making it nearly impossible to see. The crew members screamed, pressing toward the door. "Demon! Devil!" Unnatural. Their words were lost in the howl of wind. They fled, shoving past each other in their panic. But the storm didn't stop. Isolde stood at its center, eyes wide with horror, unable to control what she'd unleashed. Her powers fed on her fear, and her fear grew with each second of lost control. The feedback loop was vicious, unstoppable. She could feel the storm spreading beyond the cabin, affecting the entire ship. Ice forming on rigging, sails freezing and cracking, the vessel itself groaning under the supernatural assault. "I'm going to kill everyone aboard," she thought distantly. "I'm going to destroy the entire ship." Through the swirling ice and wind, she saw Edmund. He was fighting his way toward her, one agonizing step at a time. The wind cut at his face like knives. Ice formed on his clothing, weighing him down. The cold, the same cold that had damaged his hands before, was burning his exposed skin. "Edmund, no," she tried to shout. "Stay back." But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. He forced his way through the storm as if through deep water, his expression set with determination. When he reached her, he took her hands. Skin to skin, no hesitation. The cold bit into his still healing frostbite immediately. Isolde felt his pain as if it were her own through their connection. His damaged fingers, already numb, now burning with renewed injury. The skin of his palms turning white, blistering. "Let go," she gasped. "I'm hurting you." "Isolde." His voice cut through the wind somehow, clear and steady. "Look at me, only at me." She met his eyes. Grey, steady, unwavering despite the pain she knew he was suffering. "You are not the storm," Edmund said, his voice calm despite having to shout over the wind. "You are the eye of the storm. You are the stillness. Find it. Find the quiet place inside." "I can't." "You can. Breathe with me. In for 4 counts." He demonstrated, his breath visible in the frigid air. Isolde tried to match him, but her breathing was too fast, too shallow. "Again," Edmund insisted. "In 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. Out 2, 3, 4. Feel the air moving through you, not against you." Isolde focused on his voice, on his eyes, on the rhythm he was setting. In, hold, out. The wind was still howling, ice still forming, but she found the pattern beneath the chaos, found the place inside herself where the cold originated, where it waited for her command. Not command, she realized. Partnership. The cold wasn't her enemy. It was part of her. She didn't need to suppress it or control it. She needed to work with it, guide it, give it purpose and direction, rather than letting fear drive it wild. Gradually, so gradually she almost couldn't tell it was happening, the wind began to die. The swirling ice crystals settled. The temperature stopped dropping, hovering in the space just above freezing. When the storm finally stopped completely, the silence was deafening. Isolde looked around at the destruction. The cabin was unrecognizable. Every surface was coated in thick ice. Icicles hung from the ceiling like stalactites in a cave. The furniture was frozen solid. The wood split where water had expanded. The very walls seemed to groan with the weight of ice. And Edmund's hands. She looked down at where they still held hers. His skin was white, blistered, some areas gone frighteningly pale. His damaged fingers were worse. She couldn't tell if they still had sensation at all. "Your hands," Isolde whispered, horror stealing her voice. "I've destroyed them. I've destroyed you." Edmund's jaw was tight with pain, but his voice remained steady. "You saved yourself, and you stopped it. You pulled it back. That's what matters." "You don't understand." Isolde was shaking violently, from exhaustion and horror in equal measure. "I could have killed you. I nearly did. I told you from the beginning I'm exactly what they fear. A monster who destroys everything she touches." Edmund slowly lowered himself to sit on the ice-covered floor, cradling his damaged hands carefully. "You're not a monster. You're powerful. There's a difference." "What difference?" "The result is the same. Pain, destruction, death. A monster wouldn't care about the harm they cause," Edmund said quietly. "A monster would use power without conscience. You do care. That horror in your face, that guilt in your voice, that's precisely what makes you human. What makes you good, despite your power." Isolde slid down the wall to sit beside him in the frozen cabin. She wanted to take his hands again, to somehow undo the damage, but she was terrified of causing more harm. The door burst open, the lock long since destroyed by ice. Captain Aldrich stood there, First Mate Garrett beside him, Marcus Thorne just behind. They stared at the devastation, the ice, the floating crystals still settling from the air, the two figures sitting amid the wreckage. Captain Aldrich's face had gone pale as parchment. "We dock at Cromarty within the hour. Both of you will leave my ship immediately. Tonight, I'll not have this vessel destroyed by her." He seemed unable to finish the sentence. Marcus stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but something gleamed in his eyes. "Satisfaction, perhaps. Captain Aldrich, I'm sure the Duke will compensate you for damages. As for Miss Rivington, perhaps the authorities in Cromarty should be notified. I believe Scotland still prosecutes witchcraft in remote areas, for the safety of the community, you understand." First Mate Garrett spoke up, surprising everyone. "I'll testify it was self-defense. 5 men broke into the cabin with violent intent. I saw them planning it. I'll swear it before any magistrate." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly at this complication, his careful plan encountering an unexpected obstacle, but his expression smoothed immediately. "How noble, Garrett, truly. Well, Edmund, it seems you've inspired loyalty. Pity loyalty won't protect her from what she is." "She acted in self-defense," Garrett repeated stubbornly. "The men attacked first, and she nearly destroyed the entire ship in response," Marcus said reasonably. "Intent matters less than capability. She's dangerous. That's simply fact." Captain Aldrich seemed to shake himself from his stupor. "Garrett, see them off the ship the moment we dock. Get them ashore with whatever belongings they have. I want them gone." The 3 men withdrew, leaving Edmund and Isolde alone in the frozen cabin. "Can you stand?" Edmund asked quietly. Isolde nodded, though she felt hollowed out, exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced before. Using her powers on that scale had drained something essential from her. They gathered their few belongings in silence. Edmund's hands shook as he tried to pack his spare clothing, the simple task nearly impossible with his damaged fingers. Isolde helped him, guilt a constant weight in her chest. Above deck, they could hear the crew's voices, excited, frightened, spreading wild stories. Words like demon and devil and unnatural storm carried clearly through the frozen cabin walls. Through the porthole, Cromarty was visible now, lights twinkling in the evening darkness. A small fishing village that probably saw few strangers, especially in November. Their arrival would not be quiet. The crew would talk. Marcus had already sent letters ahead. Edmund wrapped his damaged hands carefully in clean bandages, his face tight with pain he wouldn't voice. Isolde watched him, this man who'd dove into freezing water for her, who'd let her freeze his hands twice rather than abandon her, who'd walked into the heart of a supernatural storm because she needed him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Edmund looked up, meeting her eyes. "Don't be. I made my choice. I'd make it again. Even knowing what it would cost. Especially knowing what it would cost." First Mate Garrett appeared in the doorway, his weathered face troubled. "We're docking. I'll escort you ashore. Captain's arranged for you to stay at the Crossed Anchors. It's the only inn." The innkeeper. He hesitated. "She's been told you're coming. The crew's been talking. It won't be a warm welcome." They followed him up to the deck. The November air felt warm after the frozen cabin, though it was barely above freezing. The crew members parted before them like a sea, none willing to come close. Eyes followed Isolde with naked fear and hatred. The Northern Star bumped against Cromarty's single dock. Beyond, the village waited grey, unwelcoming, already suspicious. Edmund stood beside Isolde at the rail, his bandaged hands useless at his sides. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we face it together." Isolde looked at him, this aristocrat who'd sacrificed everything for a stranger, who'd become something more than a stranger in the past week. "Together," she agreed. But as they stepped onto Scottish soil, she felt the emotional temperature of the village, cold fear, hot suspicion, and underneath it all, something darker, something that promised their troubles were only beginning. Chapter 6. Cromarty's Cold Welcome. The village of Cromarty huddled against the Scottish coast like something trying to hide from the wind. Stone buildings with slate roofs, fishing boats pulled up on the shore, nets hanging to dry in the November cold. As Edmund and Isolde walked down the gangplank, weather-worn villagers stopped their work to stare. Word had already spread. Isolde felt it immediately through her empathic sense, waves of cold fear and hot suspicion radiating from every direction. Somehow, despite the Northern Star only just docking, whispers had reached the village. Marcus's letters, sent ahead from a previous port, had done their work well. A woman pulling a cart of fish saw them approaching and quickly turned down a side street. Doors closed as they passed. A mother grabbed her child's hand and pulled the boy inside, the door slamming shut. An old man spat on the ground as Isolde walked by, making a sign against evil with his gnarled fingers. "Keep walking," Edmund murmured, though his face was tight with pain and exhaustion. His bandaged hands hung stiffly at his sides, useless for carrying anything. Isolde bore their single bag of belongings. The crossed anchors sat at the center of the village, a two-story stone building with a weathered sign depicting two ship anchors forming an X. Smoke rose from its chimney, promising warmth, but the windows were dark and unwelcoming. The inn's common room was empty when they entered, though Isolde heard movement in the back. Edmund approached the counter and rang the small bell. A woman emerged from the kitchen, Mrs. Flora McLeish, as they would learn. She was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair pulled back severely and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Her eyes swept over them, lingering on Edmund's obvious quality despite his disheveled state, then moving to Isolde with immediate suspicion. "We need lodging," Edmund said. "A room for a few days while I arrange transport." "The inn's full," Mrs. McLeish said flatly. "The common room is empty. The entire building appears empty." "Full nonetheless." Her tone brooked no argument. Edmund placed his hands carefully on the counter, the bandages stark white against the dark wood. "Madam, I am Duke Edmund Westmore of Thornfield. I have travelled a difficult journey and require—" "I know who you are," Mrs. McLeish interrupted. "Word came ahead, a duke travelling with a witch. I'll not have her kind under my roof." Isolde felt the words like a physical blow, but she'd heard worse, expected worse. She turned toward the door. "Edmund, it's fine. We'll find somewhere else." "There is nowhere else," Mrs. McLeish said, not unkindly. "Not in Cromarty. Not for her." Edmund reached into his coat with clumsy bandaged fingers and withdrew his money purse. He counted out coins slowly, his damaged hands making even this simple task difficult, and placed £10 sterling on the counter. A small fortune for a village inn, enough to feed a family for months. 3 days, he said quietly. "That is all we need. Shelter while I arrange transport north. We'll cause no trouble. We'll barely leave the room. You have my word as a gentleman, and my bond as a peer of the realm." Mrs. McLeish stared at the money. Her eyes moved to Edmund's bandaged hands, to the obvious pain he was trying to hide, then to Isolde, who stood silent, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. Something shifted in the innkeeper's severe face. 3 days, she said finally. "Not a moment more, and if anything unnatural occurs, you're out immediately. I don't care if you're a duke or the king himself." "Understood," Edmund said. "Mrs." McLeish swept the coins into her apron and produced a key. "Upstairs, last door on the left. It's small." Small was generous. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. A single small window looked out over the village square. The walls were bare stone, the floor rough wood, but it was warm, private, and infinitely better than the frozen cabin they'd left behind. Edmund immediately moved toward the floor. "You take the bed." "Edmund, you're injured. You need, I insist." His tone left no room for argument. Isolde was too exhausted to fight. She sank onto the bed, every muscle in her body aching with the aftermath of the storm she'd unleashed. Using her powers on that scale had drained something essential from her. As evening darkened the window, Isolde insisted on tending Edmund's hands. He'd been stoic about the pain, but she could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the careful way he moved. "Let me see," she said gently. Edmund sat on the edge of the bed, extending his hands. Isolde unwrapped the bandages slowly, revealing the damage beneath. It was worse than she'd feared. The frostbite had progressed angry red skin, white patches that looked waxy and dead, blistering where the skin had frozen and thawed too many times. 2 fingers on his right hand were discolored, a sickly grey purple that suggested permanent damage. "They might not regain full function," Edmund said quietly, seeing her expression. "The ship's surgeon said as much before we left." Guilt carved itself deeper into Isolde's chest. "This is my fault. All of it. This is the result of my choices," Edmund corrected. "Choices I'd make again." Isolde cleaned the wounds carefully with water from the washstand, applied the salve the surgeon had provided, wrapped them in fresh bandages. As she worked, words began spilling from her, words she'd never spoken aloud to anyone. "I was 8 years old when I froze our neighbor's well. January 1827. The middle of winter, but even so 20 feet down, frozen solid. Impossible by any natural means. Edmund listened in silence as she continued. Our neighbor, Mr. Blackwell, had kicked our dog, just kicked him for barking. I was so angry, so furious at the cruelty. I didn't mean to use my powers, didn't even know I had them, really. But that night, I dreamed of cold, of ice, of that well freezing from top to bottom. Isolde's hands trembled as she tied off the bandage. In the morning, Mr. Blackwell came to our door, shouting. His well was frozen, his family had no water, and he knew that someone had done it. He suspected my mother. People always suspect the women who know herbs and healing, the midwives and wise women. When the magistrate came to arrest her, I tried to confess. 8 years old, and I tried to tell them it was me, that my mother had nothing to do with it. But she stopped me, put her hand over my mouth and said, "They'll burn you, my darling. You're a child. I've lived my life." Isolde's voice broke. So I stayed silent, watched them take her away, watched them build the stake in the town square. I was 12 when they burned her, old enough to understand exactly what my silence had cost. I've spent 16 years running from what I am, and from what staying silent cost her. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he began speaking, his voice low and measured. Thomas was 22, full of life and laughter. I was 25, already duke after our father's death, already crushed under the weight of the estate, the title, the endless responsibilities. Thomas had no such burdens. He was free in a way I never was and never would be. Edmund flexed his damaged fingers carefully. The hunting party was on the 23rd of March, 1840. My friends from university, wealthy young men, with too much time and too much wine. They were taking increasingly reckless jumps over fences and streams, showing off like boys instead of men. Thomas wanted to prove himself, wanted to impress them, wanted to impress me. There was a stone fence, ancient, solid, nearly 5 feet high. I knew it was too high. I should have stopped him. I was the elder brother, the duke, the responsible one, but I was so tired of always being responsible. Edmund's voice tightened. So, when Thomas approached the fence, when he looked back at me for permission or approval or whatever he was seeking, I said nothing, did nothing, maybe smiled. I honestly don't remember anymore. His horse refused at the last moment. Thomas went over alone. He landed badly. I heard his neck break from 20 feet away, this awful crack, like a branch snapping. I was off my horse and running, but I knew before I reached him that he was dying. Edmund's breath caught. He looked up at me, blood on his lips, pain in his eyes, but he smiled. My brother, dying in the mud, smiled at me, and he said, "Not your fault, Edmund. Don't blame yourself. Promise me." I promised him. I lied to my dying brother because I knew it was my fault. My mother blamed me. Never said it aloud, but I saw it in her eyes at the funeral. The entire county came, and they all looked at me with the same question in their eyes. Why Thomas? Why not you? The spare who became the heir through his brother's death. And Thomas was the beloved one, the golden one. Everyone loved him. I left England 6 months later, told everyone I was touring the continent. Instead, I've been running, from their judgment, from my own guilt, from the fact that Thomas forgave me and I cannot forgive myself. Isolde took his bandaged hands gently in hers. We're the same, you and I. We both believe we deserve punishment for accidents of circumstance. My mother chose to protect me. Your brother's death was not murder, but we've both been tried and convicted by judges who live only in our own minds. Edmund looked at their joined hands, her small, work-worn seamstress's hands, holding his bandaged, aristocratic ones. Perhaps we're both innocent, or perhaps we're both guilty, but I know this. I don't regret saving you, even if these hands never fully heal, even if Marcus destroys what's left of my reputation. I don't regret any of it. The moment stretched between them, intimate and fragile. Then voices erupted from outside their door, Mrs. McLeish arguing with someone, her tone sharp. A knock. "There's a gentleman here demanding to see you." The door opened before Edmund could respond. Marcus Thorne entered, uninvited, his expensive coat and polished boots absurdly out of place in the humble room. "Still hiding in corners, Edmund?" Marcus's tone was conversational, almost friendly. "How the mighty have fallen, from Thornfield Hall to a fishing village inn with a wanted witch." "Get out," Edmund said quietly. In a moment, I thought you should know I'm not here by accident. Your mother hired me to find you, actually. She's been quite worried about her prodigal son. Hired me nearly a year ago to track you down. Marcus settled himself against the washstand as if he owned the room. But when I finally located you, I realized you'd done me a tremendous favor by leaving. You see, I was there the day Thomas died. I saw everything, and my version of events differs somewhat from yours. Edmund went very still. What are you talking about? You did more than say nothing, Edmund. You encouraged him. Come on, Thomas. Don't be a coward. Take the jump. Those were your exact words. I heard them clearly. And when he fell, you stood there frozen, paralyzed for 10 full seconds before you moved. 10 seconds, I counted. That's not. Edmund's face had gone pale. I don't remember it that way. Memory is flexible, isn't it? Especially guilty memory. You've spent 3 years rewriting history, making yourself merely neglectful rather than actively culpable. But I was there, and if I testify to what I saw before the House of Lords, they'll investigate. Causing the death of your heir through reckless encouragement, that's grounds for stripping your title, at minimum. Marcus straightened. So here's what will happen. You'll return to England with me. Face your family, face the questions, take your punishment like a man, and in exchange, I'll say nothing about Miss Rivington. She can disappear into the Scottish Highlands as she planned. She'll be safe. But if you refuse, I've already sent detailed letters to the magistrate in Inverness. Descriptions of frozen cabins, supernatural storms, a crewman's death. Scottish law may not burn witches any longer, but they do imprison them. For life, in some cases. Isolde spoke before Edmund could. Take his offer. Go back to England. I can disappear on my own. No, Edmund said simply. Before Marcus could respond, a commotion erupted downstairs, shouting, breaking glass. Mrs. McLeish's voice raised in anger. Edmund and Isolde rushed down to find the inn's common room filling with villagers. At their head stood a gaunt man of 60, with burning eyes and severe black clothing. We'll not have wickedness in our village, Reverend Callum McBride declared. First a ship's crewman dies of unnatural fever, now tales of supernatural storms and frozen cabins. This woman brings evil. Mrs. McLeish stood behind her counter, arms crossed. She's paid for lodging and she'll have it. This is my establishment, Reverend, not your kirk. The minister ignored her, addressing the crowd. It's nearly St. Andrew's Day. We'll not celebrate our patron saint with a witch among us. She must go, tonight. Edmund moved instinctively between Isolde and the crowd. Marcus watched from the shadows, satisfaction written in his eyes. And in the back, half hidden, was that first mate Garrett. The mob pressed closer, and Isolde felt their collective fear and anger like heat against her skin. The temperature in the room began to drop. Chapter 7. Fire and Flight. The crowd pressed closer, their collective fear and anger palpable in the close air of the common room. Reverend McBride stood at their head like a general commanding troops, his gaunt face lit with righteous certainty. This woman must be turned over to the magistrate, he declared. For the safety of our community, for the sanctity of our souls, she cannot remain here. Mrs. McLeish held her position behind the counter, her arms crossed, her iron-grey hair escaping its pins. I told you, Reverend, this is my establishment. She's paid for lodging and she'll have it. The laws of man matter less than the laws of the Almighty, the minister countered. The inn's back door burst open. A teenage boy, lean, dark-haired, clearly Mrs. McLeish's son, rushed in, breathless. Ma'am, they're gathering in the square. More of them. They mean to take her by force if need be. Isolde felt the temperature in the room dropping, responding to her fear. Not now. She couldn't lose control now. Not with Edmund already damaged. Not with so many people so close. Marcus Thorne's smooth voice cut through the tension. Perhaps Miss Rivington should simply go with them. If she's innocent of wrongdoing, surely the Scottish authorities will determine that fairly. Why resist lawful process? Edmund recognized the trap immediately. In a remote village like Cromarty, far from Edinburgh's courts and legal protections, Isolde would face a magistrate influenced by local superstition and fear. Even if not executed, and Scottish law was vague enough to allow for creative interpretation, she could be imprisoned indefinitely. No, Edmund said firmly. She goes nowhere with that mob. The crowd murmured, angry and uncertain. Then someone pushed through from the back, a weathered face Isolde recognized with shock. First Mate Garrett? Edmund said. The older sailor nodded, breathing hard. Your Grace. My ship hasn't sailed yet, repairs to the frozen rigging, and the captain won't risk leaving port in the dark. I came to warn you. The crew's been talking in the taverns all evening, spreading stories. The whole village knows everything now. Why are you here? Edmund asked. Garrett's weathered face tightened with shame and determination. I can't undo my cowardice on the ship, can't take back my silence when they threw her overboard. But I can help you now. There's a path north, through the hills beyond the village. It leads to the Cairngorms eventually. Remote settlements there, places where folk don't ask questions about strangers, where a man with coin can buy anonymity. You're helping them escape? Reverend McBride's voice rose with outrage. You'd help a witch flee justice? I'm helping 2 people flee a mob, Garrett corrected. There's a difference. Mrs. McLeish moved suddenly, decisively. Duncan, get them provisions from the kitchen. Bread, cheese, dried meat, whatever travels well. And fetch your father's old winter coat, the heavy one. Ma'am, Duncan stared at his mother. Do it, now. The boy disappeared into the back. Mrs. McLeish looked at Edmund and Isolde, something complex moving behind her severe expression. I had a sister once, she said quietly. People said she was fey. Strange. She could find water underground, predict storms, knew things she shouldn't know. They drove her away when I was 15. I've always wondered what became of her. I'll not have another woman's blood on this village's hands. The crowd was growing restless, pressing forward. Someone shouted from outside, Bring her out! Let us see her! The back entrance, Garrett urged. Through the kitchen. Now, while they're focused on the front. They moved quickly. Duncan reappeared with a bundle of provisions and a heavy wool coat. Mrs. McLeish thrust coins into Edmund's pocket, his own £10, returned. You'll need it more than I will. Go, quickly. But as they reached the kitchen's back door, Marcus Thorne was there, blocking the exit. Edmund tensed. Move aside, Marcus. Oh, I'm not stopping you. Marcus adjusted his fine coat. I'm coming with you. You don't think I'm staying here with an angry mob about to turn violent? I've no desire to be trampled by frightened villagers. Besides, Edmund, we're not finished with our conversation. Edmund had no time to argue, no way to stop Marcus without causing a commotion that would alert the mob. The 4 of them, Edmund, Isolde, Marcus, and Garrett leading, slipped out into the November night. The escape through Cromarty was a nightmare of shadows and suppressed panic. They moved through back alleys, between buildings, avoiding the main streets where torches were being lit and voices raised. The village was waking to violence, fear turning ordinary people into a mob. Fire purifies, someone shouted from the square. They'd nearly reached the edge of the village when Isolde looked back. Flames, rising from the center of town. The crossed anchors was burning, fire leaping from the windows, consuming the timber upper floor. The mob, unable to find Isolde, had set fire to the inn that had sheltered her. No, Isolde breathed, stopping dead. Mrs. McLeish, Duncan. They were still inside. Garrett grabbed her arm, his grip iron-strong. Flora McLeish has lived in this village her entire life. She knows every soul here, every hiding place, every escape route. She'll have gotten herself and Duncan out the moment you left. But we cannot go back. Move, or their sacrifice means nothing. Edmund took Isolde's other arm, and together they pulled her forward into the hills beyond Cromarty. Behind them, flames painted the night sky orange, and the mob's voices rose in a terrible chorus of fear and fury. The path Garrett led them to was barely visible in the darkness, a sheep track winding upward into the Highland hills. At the base, Garrett stopped. Follow this, north and west, he said, breathing hard from the climb. 3 days' walk if you push hard. It'll bring you to the Cairngorms proper. Small settlements scattered through the glens. Folk there are used to people running from something. They'll not ask questions if you don't volunteer answers. Come with us, Edmund said. Garrett shook his head. I have a ship to return to, a daughter in Portsmouth to get home to. But you take care of her, your grace. She's worth saving. He turned back toward the burning village before Edmund could respond. The first night in the wilderness was brutal. They made camp in a sheltered hollow between 2 hills, but Edmund refused to let them risk a fire. Too visible. Behind them, they could still see the faint glow of Cromarty burning. Edmund's hands throbbed with constant, nauseating pain. Isolde was weak, her earlier use of power aboard ship having drained reserves she hadn't yet recovered. They huddled together for warmth, sharing Duncan McLeish's heavy coat between them. Marcus, infuriatingly, seemed least affected by the hardship. He'd travelled rough before, he mentioned casually, knew how to sleep on cold ground, how to conserve energy, how to push through discomfort. During Edmund's watch, Marcus remained awake, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "You love her," Marcus observed quietly. It wasn't a question. Edmund didn't answer. "How noble. The Duke falls for the witch. Very romantic, very stupid." "What do you want, Marcus?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I don't actually want to see you hanged. Edmund, we were friends once, before Thomas, before everything, but I was there. I saw how your recklessness, your need to be seen as something other than the serious, responsible Duke killed him, and then I watched you walk away from it, from your family, your responsibilities, everything. You ran. So here's my question. Are you running now? Or are you finally standing still long enough to face something?" Edmund looked at Isolde, sleeping fitfully beside him. "I'm not running. Not anymore." "We'll see," Marcus said, and closed his eyes. The next day's travel was harsh. Early November in the Scottish Highlands was brutally cold, and they were dressed for sea travel, not mountain hiking. The path climbed steadily upward, following the natural contours of the land. Edmund's damaged hands made even simple tasks, agonizing, gripping, climbing, maintaining balance. Isolde tried to help without touching him directly, terrified of causing more harm. The strain between them, wanting to help, afraid to touch, was its own kind of torture. Near midday, they encountered drovers moving cattle south to market. The men eyed them suspiciously, a well-dressed gentleman with bandaged hands, a woman in an inadequate dress, and Marcus in his fine London coat. An unlikely travelling party. "You'll want to avoid the villages ahead," one drover said, his Highland accent thick. "Word spreading from Cromarty. They're looking for a witch, and the nobleman who abducted her. £50 reward." After the drovers moved on, Marcus laughed quietly. "Abducted. So now you're not just negligent, Edmund. You're a corrupted aristocrat, fallen under her spell." The narrative grows more interesting by the day. The second night was colder. They risked a small fire, the need for warmth overriding caution. Huddled close to the flames, Isolde and Edmund sat shoulder to shoulder, while Marcus kept watch. "I nearly killed you twice now," Isolde said softly. "Once on the ship, once in the cabin. What happens the next time I lose control? What happens when my fear or anger manifests and you're in the way?" Edmund's bandaged hands rested on his knees. "Then we keep practicing. We keep working on your control. You stopped the storm in the cabin. You pulled it back. That proves you can learn to master it. But what if I can't? What if this power is too much for any one person to contain?" Edmund took her cold hands in his bandaged ones, ignoring the pain the contact caused. "Then, I'll be there to help you contain it. For as long as you need, for as long as I have." They were very close, sharing warmth and breath in the firelit darkness. Isolde's eyes searched his face, finding something there that made her heart constrict. Almost, they leaned toward each other. Almost, their lips met. Marcus shifted on the other side of the fire, and the moment shattered. The third morning, they woke to find Marcus gone. His tracks led back the way they'd come, toward Cromarty and the coast. Beside the dead fire, weighted with a stone, was a note written on paper torn from a journal. "I've gone back to manage the situation. Buy you some time. Don't waste it. M." "Do we trust this?" Isolde asked. "I don't know," Edmund admitted. "But we have no choice. We keep moving." They continued north and west, into increasingly remote territory. The highlands stretched around them, beautiful and brutal, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Late on the third day, exhausted and hungry, they spotted a settlement in a valley below. Smoke rose from chimneys. Buildings clustered around what appeared to be a small kirk. It looked like safety, like rest, like hope. They approached carefully, two desperate travelers seeking shelter. The village square was modest, a well, a few shops, the stone kirk that doubled as community center and meeting hall. And on the kirk's door, and on posts around the square, notices fluttered in the wind. Edmund saw them first. His face went pale. Isolde moved closer, reading the description that matched her too well. Dark hair, small stature, unnatural abilities, wanted for witchcraft and murder. £50 sterling reward. "We need to leave," Edmund said urgently. Now, but it was too late. Rough hands grabbed them from behind village men who'd been watching, waiting. Edmund fought despite his damaged hands, landing one good blow before being overwhelmed. Isolde tried to pull away, but there were too many of them, their grips too strong. "Got them!" someone shouted. "The witch and her accomplice. £50 split between us." They were dragged toward the kirk, toward the stone building that served as both church and jail in this remote place. The villagers' hands were rough but not cruel, just men motivated by reward money in a place where £50 was a fortune. Isolde felt her powers rising in response to fear and fury, felt the cold gathering in her chest, responding to her terror. The temperature around them began to drop. Frost formed on the ground where her feet dragged across the earth. "Stop it," one of the men said nervously. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." But Isolde wasn't sure she wanted to stop it, wasn't sure she should stop it. They'd run, they'd hidden, they'd tried to be small and invisible and harmless, and still the world pursued them. Still it demanded she be punished for the crime of existing. The frost spread wider, the men's breath became visible, and as they dragged her toward the stone building that would be her prison, Isolde felt something shift inside her, not loss of control, but a deliberate choice forming. She'd spent 16 years hiding what she was, running from it, suppressing it. Perhaps it was time to stop running. Chapter 8. The Storm's Heart. The cell was bare stone walls, floor, ceiling. A single barred window let in pale November light and bitter cold. The village of Glenmore was tiny, perhaps 50 residents scattered through this isolated glen in the Cairngorms, and their kirk served multiple purposes: church, meeting hall, and when necessary, prison. Edmund sat against the wall, his face flushed with fever, his bandaged hands trembling. Isolde knelt beside him, helpless, watching infection take hold where frostbite had already done its damage. The village headman, Angus Drummond, had been practical about their capture. A man in his 60s with iron-grey hair and shrewd eyes, he'd assessed them with the cool calculation of someone for whom £50 represented more money than Glenmore saw in a year. "My son's riding to Inverness," Drummond had told them through the barred door. 2 days there, 2 days back. The magistrate will want to question you both. Until then, you'll stay here. It's nothing personal, just business. 4 days. They had perhaps 4 days before authorities arrived with soldiers and legal authority, and no chance of escape. But Edmund didn't have 4 days. Through the first night, his fever climbed. Isolde tended him with their limited resources, water from a bucket the guards had provided. Her own shawl dampened and pressed to his burning forehead. His bandages needed changing, but she had nothing clean to replace them with. In his delirium, Edmund spoke to ghosts. "Thomas, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His head turned restlessly against the stone. "I should have stopped you. Should have said something. Anything. I was the elder brother, the responsible one. It was my job to protect you." Isolde held his good hand, the left one, less damaged, and felt utterly powerless. This man had dove into freezing water for her, had let her freeze his hands twice rather than abandon her, had fought for her, fled for her, sacrificed everything for her, and her powers, the abilities she'd spent 16 years suppressing, had destroyed him. By the second day, Edmund's condition had worsened. Red streaks spread up his arms from the infected wounds. His fever made him incoherent, speaking in fragments that broke Isolde's heart. She pounded on the door until Angus Drummond came. "Please," she begged. "He needs a doctor. The infection it's spreading. He'll die without treatment." Drummond's weathered face showed something like sympathy, but his voice remained firm. "The doctor's in the next valley, half a day's ride. By the time he'd return, the magistrate will be nearly here anyway. The Duke will get proper treatment in Inverness. Better facilities there than anything our doctor could provide. He won't survive the journey to Inverness. Then you'd best pray the magistrate rides fast." Drummond walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridor. Isolde sank down beside Edmund, who was shaking with fever chills despite the burning heat of his skin. She looked at her hands, these hands that created ice, that froze and destroyed, that had cost her mother's life, and now Edmund's as well. Unless, the thought formed slowly, dangerously, she could use her powers to escape, could freeze the lock, shatter it, carry Edmund out of here and what? He could barely walk. She was exhausted from days of travel and fear. They'd die in the wilderness even if she freed them, but they'd die here too, if she did nothing. That night, as the village slept, Isolde made her choice. She stood before the heavy wooden door, studying the iron lock mechanism. Metal, brittle when frozen. She'd seen this principle before, water expanding in cracks, splitting stone, ice breaking iron. She reached for her power deliberately, carefully, not in fear or desperation, but with purpose. She felt the cold respond, eager as always, and she guided it toward the lock, focused on the moisture in the air around the metal, on the water molecules that clung to every surface. Freeze, crystallize, expand. The lock mechanism turned white with frost. Ice crept into every crevice, every gap in the metalwork. Isolde maintained the cold, kept it concentrated, felt the metal growing brittle beneath the intense cold. When she struck it with a stone from the floor, the lock shattered. The door swung open. Freedom! But Edmund could barely stand, his weight heavy against her as she helped him up. They stumbled into the Kirk's main chamber, a simple space with wooden pews and a stone altar. The outer door was barred from the outside. They were still trapped. Isolde's mind raced. She needed to draw the guards inside, needed them to open that door. But if she lost control, if she hurt them, no, she wouldn't lose control. Not this time. She looked around the Kirk, at the sacred space, at the morning light just beginning to filter through the eastern window. An idea formed, not born of desperation, but of something else. Hope, perhaps, or faith in herself. Isolde reached for her power again, but this time with different intent. She didn't want destruction, didn't want fear. She wanted beauty. She focused on the moisture in the air, on the way light caught in ice crystals, on the aurora borealis she'd seen once as a child before her mother died. She shaped her power with delicate precision, creating ice crystals that hung suspended in the air, each one catching and refracting the dim light. The crystals multiplied, hundreds of them, thousands, dancing through the Kirk like snowflakes that refused to fall. They caught the light and threw it in rainbow patterns across the stone walls. Some glowed with their own cold luminescence, impossible and beautiful. It was like aurora borealis contained within four walls, swirling curtains of light and ice, prismatic and ethereal, and utterly mesmerizing. She heard voices outside, footsteps running, the bar being lifted. The door opened. Two guards stood there, their expressions shifting from alarm to stunned wonder. They stared at the impossible beauty dancing through their Kirk, fear giving way to something like reverence. "What?" one breathed. Isolde and Edmund slipped past them, out into the November night. The guards barely noticed, transfixed by the display she'd left behind. But the exertion had cost her everything. Isolde's legs trembled. Her vision swam. Creating beauty, maintaining that level of control and precision, had drained her more completely than any destructive outburst ever had. They stumbled into the wilderness beyond Glenmore. Snow was falling light at first, then heavier. Isolde couldn't tell if it was natural or if her depleted powers were influencing the weather unconsciously. They found shelter in a stand of pine trees, but it was inadequate. No supplies, no fire. Edmund was feverish again, barely conscious, the brief walk having exhausted what little strength he had left. This was the end. Isolde knew it with terrible certainty. They would die here in the wilderness, together but alone, frozen and forgotten. She held Edmund close, trying to share what warmth she had. His fever burned against her, but his lips were blue, his breathing shallow. "I spent 16 years afraid of what I am," she whispered to him, not knowing if he could hear. "Afraid I'd hurt someone else the way I hurt my mother, and I was right to be afraid I hurt you. Your beautiful hands, destroyed because you touched me." Edmund's eyes opened briefly, unfocused. "But you were also right," Isolde continued. "I'm not just destruction. Tonight in the Kirk, I made something beautiful. For the first time in my life, I used this curse to create rather than destroy. And do you know why? Because of you. Because you saw something in me worth saving. Not a curse," Edmund managed, his voice barely audible. "A gift. You just needed to see it." Then his eyes closed again, his breathing becoming more labored. Isolde felt panic rising. Edmund would die. Here, now, because she couldn't keep him warm, couldn't break his fever, couldn't wait. She couldn't keep him warm with body heat alone, but she could use her powers, not to freeze, but to preserve, not to destroy, but to heal. Isolde stood on shaking legs. She reached for her power one more time, though she had so little left to give. She focused on the snow around them, on the ice, on the cold that was her birthright and her curse and her gift. She built walls, shaped snow and ice into a shelter around them, thick enough to block the wind but with gaps for air. An igloo, architecturally impossible, created by will and desperation and 16 years of suppressed power, finally channeled with purpose. Inside the shelter, protected from the wind, the temperature rose slightly, but Edmund's fever was still too high, burning him from within. The most delicate task, the most dangerous. Isolde knelt beside him and placed her hands on his chest, feeling the heat of infection, the racing of his heart. She reached for the cold inside herself, and instead of pushing it outward, she used it as a tool. She drew heat from Edmund's body carefully, gradually, monitoring constantly. Not enough to freeze him, not enough to harm, just enough to break the fever's dangerous peak. It was like trying to remove a single thread from a tapestry without disturbing the rest. Every instinct screamed at her to push harder, to freeze away the infection entirely, but that would kill him as surely as the fever would. So she worked with impossible precision, drawing away excess heat, degree by degree, maintaining a temperature that would preserve rather than destroy. Hours passed. Dawn light filtered through the ice walls, turning them translucent, beautiful. Isolde's entire world narrowed to Edmund's temperature, his heartbeat, his breathing. She adjusted constantly, responding to the smallest changes. When his fever finally broke, when his breathing evened into natural sleep rather than feverish delirium, Isolde collapsed beside him. She had nothing left, had pushed beyond every limit she'd known existed. But Edmund was alive, sleeping peacefully in a shelter of ice that should have killed him but instead had saved him. For the first time in her life, her powers felt like they belonged to her, rather than the reverse. She slept. Voices woke her. Morning light, brighter now. Isolde's eyes opened to see figures standing outside their ice shelter, peering in through the translucent walls. Angus Drummond's weathered face appeared at the opening. Behind him, several villagers stood with expressions of wonder rather than fear. "The guards told us what they saw in the kirk," Drummond said slowly. "Light dancing like the aurora. Beauty beyond words." He touched the ice wall, solid and smooth and architecturally impossible. "And you're still alive, both of you. Should have died in this cold. But you built this?" Isolde positioned herself protectively in front of Edmund's sleeping form. "I did what I had to do." "Aye," Drummond said. "That you did." He studied the shelter with something like respect. "There's a rider coming from the south. Not the magistrate, someone else. Says he's a friend of yours, Lord Marcus Thorne. Arrived in Glenmore an hour ago with 2 others. Marcus appeared through the trees then, picking his way carefully through the snow. And behind him, impossibly, first mate Garrett and Mrs. Flora MacLeish, both wrapped in heavy travelling cloaks, both looking weary but determined. Marcus stopped at the edge of the ice shelter, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk, all of us, because the magistrate from Inverness is half a day behind me, and he's bringing soldiers." Chapter 9. Clear skies. Angus Drummond's house was the largest in Glenmore, a 2-story stone building that served as both home and informal community centre. In the main room, an unlikely council gathered. Edmund, pale and weak but conscious. Isolde, exhausted to her bones. Marcus Thorne, his fine clothes finally showing the wear of travel. First mate Garrett, weathered and resolute. And Mrs. Flora MacLeish, her iron-grey hair escaping its pins, soot still smudged on her cheek. The magistrate's party was perhaps 6 hours away. "Tell me you survived," Edmund said to Mrs. MacLeish. The relief in his voice was palpable. "Duncan and I got out through the cellar the moment you left," she said matter-of-factly. "I've lived in Cromarty my entire life. I know every hiding place, every escape route. We watched from the hills as they burned my establishment to the ground." Her voice hardened. "But I'll not have that girl hang for the crime of being different. So I found Garrett and convinced him we had work to do." Garrett nodded. "I went back to the Northern Star, spoke to the crew members who attacked Miss Rivington in the cabin. Some of them were ashamed of what they'd done, ashamed enough to sign written statements." He produced folded papers from his coat, testimony that she acted in self-defense, that they broke in with violent intent. "It's not much, but it's something." Edmund took the papers with his bandaged hands, scanning them. This could make the difference. Marcus, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "I've been corresponding with the magistrate. I told him about Thomas's death, about your flight from England. I was prepared to see you face consequences, Edmund. Prepared to testify to my version of events." Edmund went very still. "But then I watched you nearly die protecting this girl," Marcus continued. Watched her save your life with the very powers everyone fears. And I realized something I should have understood 3 years ago." He paused, something like pain crossing his refined features. "I've spent 3 years angry at you for leaving, for running from Thomas's death while I stayed to face the whispers and questions, but I was really angry at myself. I was there that day too. I could have stopped Thomas from making that jump. We were all young, all drunk, all reckless. You blame yourself for encouraging him. I blame myself for not discouraging him. We're both right. We're both wrong." The room was silent except for the crackling fire. "I'm going to tell the magistrate the truth," Marcus said. "The complete truth. Thomas's death was an accident born of collective stupidity and youth, not your murder. And Miss Rivington's actions have been self-defense and survival, not witchcraft and malice." "That's generous of you," Angus Drummond said slowly. "But the law's not always interested in truth. Sir William Blackwood, the magistrate from Inverness, he's known for harsh interpretations. Scottish law on witchcraft is vague, officially repealed, aye, but still prosecutable under other statutes. Disturbing the peace through supernatural means, endangering public safety. He can find a way to imprison her if he's determined." "Then we need more than testimony," Edmund said. You need someone who speaks for the village." Drummond interrupted. "My wife's still at the kirk, keeping the guards entertained with stories of the beautiful ice light. The village is divided. Some want the reward money, but others saw something in that kirk that moved them. Something beautiful." He looked at Isolde with unexpected kindness. "My grandmother was a bean-seeth, a seer. She predicted deaths, saw visions. The ministers condemned her, but she helped many families prepare for loss, gave them time to say goodbye. I'll not see another woman punished for gifts she didn't ask for. The old ways hold strong in the Highlands. Not all supernatural occurrences are evil here." Mrs. McLeish nodded firmly. "I'll testify about the mob in Cromarty, about the fire they set. I'll present the crew statements," Garrett added. "And I'll speak truth about Thomas," Marcus said. "And I," Edmund said quietly, "will use my full authority as Duke of Thornfield. For the first time in 3 years, I'll stand as who I actually am." All eyes turned to Isolde. "But the key is you," Edmund said gently. "You must testify, must show them what you can do, not in fear or desperation, but with control. Must demonstrate that your powers can create beauty as well as destruction." Isolde's hands trembled in her lap. "What if I lose control again? What if my fear, standing before the magistrate and soldiers, causes another storm?" Edmund reached over, taking her hand in his bandaged one, despite the pain the contact caused. "Then I'll be there to anchor you, as I've been since the beginning." The sound of horses reached them, multiple riders approaching fast. Through the window, they saw a severe man in dark clothing, leading 6 soldiers, all armed. Sir William Blackwood had arrived. The confrontation took place in Drummond's common room. Sir William was a man of 50 with iron-grey hair and eyes like flint. He surveyed the gathered group with cold assessment. "I've come for the woman accused of witchcraft," he said without preamble. "Isolde Rivington, and the Duke of Thornfield, who's wanted for questioning regarding his brother's death and his subsequent flight from England." "Then you'll hear testimony from all of us," Edmund said, standing despite his weakness. "Before you make any arrests." Sir William's expression suggested he found this presumptuous, but he gestured for them to proceed. Marcus spoke first, his aristocratic bearing lending weight to his words. He described Thomas's death in unflinching detail, the hunting party, the recklessness, the terrible accident. "This man needs no punishment beyond what he's inflicted upon himself. 3 years of exile, 3 years of guilt for an accident he could not have prevented." Garrett presented the crew statements, his sailor's voice rough but sincere. Mrs. McLeish described the mob violence in Cromarty with quiet fury. Drummond spoke of Highland traditions, of gifts that existed outside English understanding. Sir William listened to it all with no change in expression. When they finished, he turned to Isolde. "These are pretty words, but I have reports of frozen cabins, unnatural storms, a crewman's death. How do you answer these accusations, Miss Rivington?" Isolde stood on shaking legs. This was the moment. She could run again, hide again, claim the powers weren't hers to control, or she could embrace the truth. "I am what they say," she said clearly. "I can manipulate cold, ice, temperature. I can sense emotions like reading the weather. These abilities are part of me, as much as my brown eyes or my height. I didn't ask for them." My mother died protecting me from people who feared them. I've spent 16 years hiding, suppressing, denying what I am." She took a breath, steadying herself. "But these powers are not evil. They're simply power neutral until used. I've caused harm, yes, in fear, in desperation, when I had no control. But I've also saved lives. I kept Duke Edmund alive through a freezing night when he should have died from fever and cold. I've learned control. Not perfect control, I may never achieve that, but enough to choose creation over destruction." Sir William's eyes narrowed. "Prove it. Show me this control you claim." Isolde looked at Edmund. He nodded, his faith in her absolute. She closed her eyes and found the still place inside herself, the eye of the storm. When she opened them, she reached for her power with deliberate intent. Ice formed in the air above her palm, not chaotic, not destructive, but shaped with artistic precision. A bird took form, wings spread in flight, every feather distinct. It rotated slowly, catching the afternoon light. Then it dissolved, and a rose bloomed in its place, petals of ice so delicate they seemed impossible, yet holding their shape with perfect stability. Isolde let the rose fade and created something more complex. Two figures dancing, their movements fluid and graceful, frozen in ice yet somehow conveying motion and life. She turned to the windows and frost spread across them, not the chaotic patterns of her fear, but deliberate artistry. The frost caught the sunlight and threw rainbows across the room, painting the walls in prismatic light. Finally, she demonstrated the finest control. She lowered the room's temperature exactly 5 degrees, then raised it back, then lowered it again. The soldiers could feel the change, precise and measured and completely controlled. The armed men, who'd entered ready for violence, stood with lowered weapons, transfixed. Sir William watched with an expression that slowly shifted from suspicion towards something reluctantly approaching wonder. "Show me the storm," Sir William demanded. "Show me the danger they speak of. Show me you're not simply performing tricks." Isolde met his eyes steadily. I have the power to freeze this room, to create winds that would tear the roof from this building, to unleash everything they fear. But I won't. That's the difference between power and control, knowing when not to use it. You'll have to take my word that I can be dangerous, because I can also choose not to be." The magistrate was silent for a long moment, weighing law against evidence, fear against reason. Edmund stepped forward, using his full ducal authority for the first time in 3 years. "Miss Rivington will be entering my household as my betrothed. She will live at Thornfield Hall under my protection and responsibility. If she causes any harm through her abilities, I accept full legal liability as her future husband. I offer my title, my estates, my fortune as bond for her conduct." The room erupted in murmurs. Isolde stared at Edmund in shock. This was binding a peer of the realm, offering everything he possessed as surety. Sir William studied Edmund for a long moment. "You would stake everything? Your family's legacy? Your position? Your wealth?" "Everything," Edmund said without hesitation. Another silence, this one stretching until Isolde thought she might shatter from tension. "Very well," Sir William said finally. "But Miss Rivington must register with the Crown. There will be monitoring. Periodic reports on her conduct. Any incidents, any complaints, any evidence of harm, and this agreement is void. She'll face the full weight of Scottish and English law. Is that understood?" "Understood," Edmund and Isolde said together. They'd won, barely, conditionally, but they'd won. As the magistrate and soldiers departed, the room exhaled collectively. Mrs. MacLeish pulled Isolde into a fierce embrace. Garrett shook Edmund's hand carefully, mindful of the bandages. Marcus simply nodded, the closest he'd come to approval. When they were finally alone in a small room Drummond had provided, Isolde turned to Edmund. "You called me your betrothed. You offered everything." Edmund took her hands gently. "I meant it, if you'll have me. Not because you need protection, you've proven you can protect yourself, but because I cannot imagine a life without you in it. You've shown me how to face the past, rather than run from it. You've shown me that redemption isn't about suffering, it's about choosing to do better. I've spent 16 years afraid to be seen," Isolde said softly. "You've seen all of me, the power, the fear, the guilt, the capacity for destruction, and you stayed. You dove into freezing water for me. You let me damage your hands. You offered your title, your future. How could I not love you?" They kissed for the first time, truly, freely, without desperation or fear or the weight of immediate danger. It was gentle, genuine, the beginning of something rather than its culmination. 6 weeks later, winter had settled over Thornfield Hall in Derbyshire. Edmund's return had caused considerable stir. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had wept and raged in equal measure, grateful her son lived, appalled at the circumstances of his return. But she was a practical woman, and Isolde's abilities proved useful quickly enough to earn grudging respect if not warmth. On a clear December morning, Edmund and Isolde walked to the family plot where Thomas was buried. The headstone was elegant. Thomas Edmund Westmore, beloved son and brother, 1818 to 1840. Edmund knelt, Isolde standing quietly beside him. "I'm sorry I wasn't more careful," Edmund said to the stone. "Sorry I encouraged your recklessness, but I understand now that I can't undo the past by destroying my future. You told me not to blame myself. I'm trying, Thomas. I'm finally trying to forgive myself for not being perfect, for being young and stupid and human." A letter from Marcus had arrived that morning, stilted but sincere, speaking of his own visits to Thomas's grave, his own process of forgiveness. The friendship was mending slowly, both men acknowledging their shared guilt and shared humanity. At Thornfield, Isolde had begun using her powers openly and practically. The estate's icehouse never lacked ice, even in the warmest months. She could predict storms days in advance through her empathic sense of atmospheric pressure. She'd taught herself to use cold for food preservation, for medical applications, reducing inflammation, managing fevers. The village had been suspicious initially, but when the blacksmith's young son had suffered a dangerous fever, and Isolde had reduced it as she'd done for Edmund, and the boy had lived, word had spread. Not acceptance, perhaps, but tolerance. And sometimes tolerance was the seed from which acceptance eventually grew. On a winter evening, Edmund and Isolde stood at the library window, watching natural snow fall gently over the estate. His hands still bore scars from the frostbite. 2 fingers on his right hand remained stiff, slightly crooked, a permanent reminder. But they functioned well enough for everything that mattered. Isolde created snowflakes that danced in the air inside the warm room, each one unique and perfect, defying gravity with her will alone. Edmund watched with the same wonder he'd shown the first time. "No regrets?" Isolde asked softly, looking at his scarred hands. Edmund took her hand, weaving his damaged fingers through hers, the fit imperfect, but somehow right. "Only that I didn't dive in sooner." Outside, the storm had long since passed. The sky cleared to reveal stars bright and cold and beautiful against the winter darkness. Inside Thornfield Hall, 2 people who'd found each other in drowning had learned to breathe again. They were neither haunted by the past nor afraid of the future, but fully present in this moment, warm despite the winter, together despite everything that had tried to separate them, at peace with the storms they'd weathered and the storms yet to come. The cold was no longer Isolde's curse or her prison. It was simply part of her, like Edmund's grey eyes or his steady hands or his capacity for diving into freezing water for strangers who became something infinitely more. And in the library of Thornfield Hall, as snow fell both inside and out, that was more than enough. And so Isolde and Edmund found their peace not by hiding from who they were, but by embracing it. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about being saved, but about being truly seen. If Isolde and Edmund's journey moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. It helps more people discover stories like this one. What did you think of Isolde's transformation from hiding her powers to embracing them, and Edmund's journey from running from his guilt to finally facing it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing which moments resonated with you most. This is just one of many historical romance stories on this channel. If you enjoyed this tale of love, redemption, and finding acceptance, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Up next, you might enjoy A Poor Lady Gave her last crust of bread to a beggar on Christmas Eve. The next morning, he returned as a prince in a royal carriage. I'll link it in the description, and it'll appear on your screen in just a moment. Thank you so much for spending this time with Isolde and Edmund. Remember, the most powerful thing we can do is choose to be seen for who we truly are and to see others the same way. Until the next story, take care of yourselves and each other.